what time is Isha over there?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, so 8:45 is the adhan, yeah? So nice hour, inshallah. Just before we start, I would like to sincerely apologise for last week. I told Brother Shafi he phoned a few hours, like he does every week, a few hours before I leave. So I said, yes, mashallah, I'll be with you soon, inshallah. But between that time and actually leaving, my blood sugar level fell very low. I was moving some things maybe early in the morning, maybe I overdid it and it had an effect later on. I'm diabetic, so very seldom, maybe once every 7-8 months this kind of happens. When it does, I know I just need to get in bed and lie down because the sugar is low, feel nauseous. So I had to cancel right at the last minute. That's not my habit. If I am going to cancel, I tend to let people know well in advance because as I value my time, I know that your time too is very precious. So those of you who came last week and there wasn't a class, I do apologise for that, sincerely, inshallah. Are there sisters there? Oh, there are sisters there, okay. So I do apologise for last week, inshallah. I pray and intend for it not to happen again, inshallah, or not at least last minute cancellations. Okay. So the text we are going to be looking at, it's mentioned as a course. This is less of a course and more of a class. A course is something that you hope to finish within a fairly short amount of time, and even if you extend it to say about 10 weeks. There are 42 hadiths here. In the 40 hadiths of Imam Nawawis, there are 42 hadiths. Some of them are quite long. Most of them are of medium size. But because each of them are foundational, very foundational to the religion, it's very difficult to finish it in kind of 10 weeks in like a 45-minute, 50-minute slot. So we are looking for the long haul. We're looking here to probably roll up our sleeves and go well beyond 10 weeks, well beyond course. So let's call these classes, weekly classes, which is what really they are. So with that being said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh, wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له واشهد ان لا اله الا الله وحده لا شريك له واشهد ان محمدا عبده ورسوله اما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمه الله. We begin first and foremost by thanking and praising Allah. We praise Allah, we seek His aid and assistance, and we seek His forgiveness, and we seek refuge in Allah from the evil whisperings to our own souls and our own evil resultant actions. Whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. But whomsoever Allah leads astray, none can guide that person aright. And I bear witness and testify that none has the right to be worshipped except Allah alone, having no partner whatsoever. And I bear witness also that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Allah's final prophet and messenger. We praise and thank Allah that He brings us together, not for any worldly motive, but for His sake. For seeking His pleasure and for seeking to draw closer to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the means, the wasila to draw closer to Him is no doubt ilm, is no doubt knowledge. Knowledge is a means, the worship and the worship and the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the goal. Knowledge is the means and the worship and the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the goal. But as Imam al-Bukhari rahmatullah alayhi says, in his Sahih Bukhari, he has a chapter heading, he says, Al-ilmu qabla al-qawli wal-amal. Knowledge comes before speech and action. Why? Without knowledge, we won't know what the right thing to say is. We won't know what the right thing to do is. We may start inventing lies about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if they're based upon good intentions. But we may start saying things about Him that aren't true. Okay? Knowledge will be that thing that can correct that can help, that can hopefully help us not say false things about Allah, but rather say the right things about Allah. Okay? Likewise, actions out of good intention. We may think, oh, this is a good way to draw closer to Allah. This is a good way to please Allah. And perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't like that. And because He knows man's intellect, even if it's a God-given gift, intellect is a gift, but it's limited. Allah in His mercy sent to us prophets and messengers, alayhimu salatu wassalam, with this function, that they may inform us about the will of Allah, what Allah wants from us, how He wants us to live, what He wants us to aspire to. And so that becomes the path to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And from those great portions of knowledge is that type of knowledge which will secure our foundations. Securing the basics is always the best thing. Because when the foundations are strong, one can build a very solid, even a large house on firm foundations. But if the foundations are like quicksand or like cobwebs, then there is no hope of building something substantial on cobwebs or quicksand, because it's all going to collapse. The human being, okay, we are like a building. And inside of us, we have foundations. When those foundations are as strong as concrete, then we can build the human character, the human personality, the human being on that strong foundation. But when the foundation is weak, it's very difficult to build a good human being. And too many of us today in this fast-paced life want to take shortcuts in building a true human being, but that's just not possible. There are many things that you can take a shortcut in, and it could work. I'm not going to suggest any of them, right? Okay, only because we'll see in one of the hadiths here, Inna Allah kataba al-ihsan ala kulli shay. Indeed, Allah loves excellence in all that you do. Okay, we'll come to that hadith later on. And so shortcuts really isn't the way of excellence, and more often than not, shortcuts in building something important tends to have disastrous consequences, if not on the short term, on the short run, definitely on the long run. Right? So from those foundational knowledges is this particular text, the Matan al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyah, the text of Imam Nawawis 40 hadith. This has become one of the major foundational books in just having a good introduction to the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, sometimes in the quest for learning knowledge, and I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, we start digging into the bigger books. Okay, I remember one day I was working in a bookshop, and they were selling English Arabic translation of Sahih Bukhari, which was in about 9 or 10 volumes. And at that time, it was about £90, something like that. And when people used to come in, you know, just ordinary brothers and sisters, Muslim men and women used to come in from the streets and say, oh, you've got Sahih Bukhari, I heard you've got the whole complete volumes of Sahih Bukhari. I said, yes, mashallah, they're up there, 9 volumes. Oh, well, I'd like to buy it. How much? £100 or £90 or whatever it was. Oh, and as they pull out money, I said, brothers and sisters, stop there. Why not go for something like this? Why not go and buy Riyadh al-Salihin? Because the truth is, first and foremost, not too impressed with the translation, but leaving that point alone, what are you going to do with Sahih Bukhari? What are you going to do? What is an average layperson going to do, apart from having the barakah of it in your house? What are you going to do? Out of the 6,000 other hadith, most of those hadiths are very hard to understand, and they need to be contextualized. Sahih Bukhari not only has commentaries on the hadiths, Fathul Bari of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, okay, Umdat al-Qari of the Hanafi scholar Al-Aini, Faydul Bari. These are large 15, 18, 20 volume commentaries on the hadith. But you actually even have on the chapter headings that Bukhari himself wrote, before he brings the hadith. There are as many commentaries on the chapter headings of Bukhari as there are on the actual hadiths in Sahih Bukhari. Why? Because Imam al-Bukhari was a deep jurist, a jurist which we give the title Mujtahid, reached the highest level of Islamic fiqh jurisprudence. So when he writes a chapter heading, that's all of his intellectual sophistication in Islamic law has gone into that. And not any Tom, Dick and Harry can come and unravel that, not without some tools and a key. So what can we do with Sahih Bukhari? We can read maybe a few hadiths here in the beginning, Kitab al-Iman, Kitab al-Wahi, Kitab al-Ilm, a few hadiths there in volume 1, a few hadiths at the end in volume 9, Kitab al-Tawheed, Kitab al-Sunnah, but the rest of the 8 volumes, which is the majority of the we won't be able to make much use of. Riyadh al-Salihin, on the other hand, was written by a scholar precisely for educated scholars and educated lay people to take benefit from at their various levels. We have to learn to eat the correct food and not eat food which is either we're too advanced for, or it is too advanced for us. We should have that much religious intelligence to know what spiritual food is good for me. And as a teacher has that job to nicely say, actually, you need to be moving on from liquids to solids. Or actually, you need to be staying on liquids because solids isn't good for you. Otherwise, we start eating the wrong food spiritually, and we will grow, but we will grow in all sorts of odd ways. Is that clear? It's absolutely foundation. And I mention this because this is an age in which our scholars are few, and the egos are big. We live in a time in which our ulama, our scholars are few, so the religious guides, there are very few people who can hold you by the hand and bi'idhnillah, guide us safely on the journey in the darkness of the night. And the egos are big because even at the age of 6 or 7, I'm telling my father I'm no better than him. Right? That's the age of, forget about father. So if we're doing that with fathers and mums and dads at the age of 6 and 7, and we're doing that with our teachers at the age of 9 and 10 in school, we'll be doing that with our scholars at the age of 13 and 14, if not before. Add to that the internet, which makes it even worse, then that's exactly what we've got. Big egos, small hearts, narrow minds. And only by Allah's mercy, knowledge is the beginnings of that cure. So this is a book which is going to be foundational, and we should have it in our heart. One, to thank the author, Imam Nawawis. We should also have it in our hearts to thank the organisers. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man lam yashkuri nasa, lam yashkuri Allah." Whoever doesn't thank the people doesn't thank Allah. And what we want to get out of this knowledge is not just some technical information, some academic learning. We want to get out of it a transformation in the soul, a reminder of Allah, something that makes us humble. Right? And how can you gauge, how can we gauge, or you gauge, is this going to be beneficial for me or not? At the end of every lesson, or a few days after every lesson, ask yourself this question. Has this knowledge increased me in amal, in action? Either action of the heart, I'm more in love with Allah, I fear Him more, I remember Him more, I trust and rely upon Him more, I'm in awe of Him more, I'm in awe and amazement of Him more. Has it increased me in action, amal, either action of the heart, as I've suggested, action of the tongue, that I'm more kind with my words, I lie less, I backbite less, I say nice words to people, okay? I recite Quran more, I say Assalamu alaikum more, I make dhikr of Allah more, or action of the limbs, prayer and fasting and charity and reciting Quran, obedience to parents, so on and so forth. If it has increased us somewhat, even if an iota in amal, in action, then this knowledge is personally beneficial for me. If it's not doing that, then there is nothing wrong with the food. There may be something wrong about how it's being served, or it may be that not wrong with how it's being served, how it's being eaten. Okay? But there's nothing wrong with the food. Right? Okay. Very quickly, Imam Nawawis, he's one of those great Shafi'i scholars in mainstream Orthodox Sunni Islam. What remains of Islamic law is 4 major schools: Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki and Hanbali, or Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanbali. And Imam Nawawi was a Shafi'i scholar. He was born, in the English date, he's born around about 1233 and dies 1277. 1277 of the Common Era. We used to call it the Christian era, but now it's called the Common Era, CE. 1277 is roughly 676 Hijrah. 676 years after the Prophet made the migration from Makkah to Medina. 676. And he's born in Nawal, which is a town in Syria. And he became not only one of the great scholars of Islamic law, fiqh, he became one of the great scholars of Hadith. He was a great pietist and a zahid that he did without much of the world. He was a courageous scholar that he would, with soft words but with great bravery, he would even address kings and remind them, kings and princes and those of authority, remind them how they're violating their duty. Not shouting, that's never the way. Not shouting and wagging, very quietly but courageously. Don't mistake shouting with courage. Just like the mighty messenger of God, Musa alayhi salam. What did Allah say to Musa alayhi salam when he goes to Pharaoh? Musa alayhi salam is the greatest of the human beings alive. Pharaoh is got to be, if not the worst, one of the worst alive. فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَأَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرَ أَوْ يَخْشَى. Moses is instructed alayhi salam to go to Pharaoh and say to him a word that is mild, قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا, very soft. Say to him a word that is soft. Perchance he may fear. Perchance he may be reminded. Not go and shout at him, wag your finger at him. That's not the way at all. Why? Because someone like that will only become more arrogant and say, out with you or off with your head. Whatever good you think you're going to achieve is not going to happen. Part of immaturity is when people think the way is just to shout down. And shouting is a sign of your real firm commitment to Islam. No. Shouting is a sign of, is not necessarily a sign. Action on the book and the Sunnah is the sign. Okay. So Imam Nawawi, so he's 676, he died, rahmatullahi alayh. And in these 44 years of his life, which is quite a short life for a scholar, he wrote an amazing number of books. A commentary on Sahih Muslim, which is indispensable. A number of, and Sharh Sahih Muslim is so indispensable, you can't study Sahih Muslim without Imam Nawawi's 18 slim volume commentary. He wrote Sharh al-Muhadhab in Shafi'i Fiqh and Al-Minhaj in Shafi'i Fiqh and Rawd al-Talibin in Shafi'i Fiqh, all of which become indispensable in learning Shafi'i Fiqh at a high degree. And again, Sharh al-Muhadhab is in about 30 odd volumes, and between Rawd al-Talibin and Minhaj, you're talking about 10, 15 volumes between them both. So 10, 15 volumes there, 30 volumes there, 18 slim volumes there. Then he has the 40 Hadith, he has Riyadh al-Salihin, he has Bustan al-Arifin. He has another 20 more books on top of that. But the point is, in nearly every science of Islam, nearly every science, when Imam Nawawi writes a book, it becomes one of the foundational books. Now for a scholar to write many books and to have one book become famous is like amazing, right? It's a bit like an artist, he paints 100 paintings, and to have one or two paintings in his lifetime become successful, he will be a really happy man. Many things happen after your death, but in your lifetime, Imam Nawawi, more or less in his lifetime, he had a number of books that became sources of knowledge by the scholars and accepted by the scholars in his time. 44 years, remembering he's a child for some of those years as well. So in less than 40 years, he writes so much, he has such a scholarly legacy. Our scholars say, how is it that in 40 short years, a man can write not just so much, because there are other scholars who have written more in a short space of time in our history. Okay? But how is it that he can write so much and they are works of such brilliance and academic excellence and spiritual beauty that they become accepted in his time and definitely after his time. They say the secret of that is ikhlas, sincerity, Imam Nawawi's sincerity. How he wasn't attached to the world and the praise of the people, it was just Allah. 1277, just to give you a timeline, what's happening here in Britain or in England. Okay, because it's always nice to kind of know what's, where we are, because otherwise 1277, 767, 676 doesn't mean anything to most people. 676 Hijri is 50, 80 years before that, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is teaching in Baghdad. 50 years before that, Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi is teaching just outside of Nisapur and that kind of area. So it's that kind of time. In this country, we have Edward I, on the throne. We call him Edward Longshanks, very famous for fighting against the Scots. In fact, he's called the Hammer of the Scots. And then you have William Wallace, Braveheart. That's that kind of era, Edward I. The kind of kings that have a French connection for the last 200 years before that. And it's beginning to be the beginnings of what we begin to see as Parliament really taking shape, the common law becoming much more common amongst people, and the barons and the common people are beginning to negotiate with the king, saying, you know, we need a bit more rights. Eventually, those negotiations between the common people and the king and in between, eventually that becomes the foundation of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and what we now have as a civil parliament. So that's the timeline. How we're going to do this, we're going to read the matan, the text, in Arabic. Today I'll read it, but next week it would be nice if I have a reader. And we'll read the Hadith in English, and then we'll make I'll make some points and commentary. This is not going to be a scholastic commentary. There are, on my bookshelf I have, about 12, 13 commentaries. We're not going to go through every difference of opinion. Rather, I'm just going to stick with one for what is beneficial. However, on some issues that might be a bit tricky, or in which, even in our society, there's more than one opinion, I'll mention it so that at least we'll know, there is another opinion. An example, for example. These are not to do with Hadith, but as an issue. This is the month of Dhul Hijjah, the last month in the Islamic calendar, the month of Hajj. And these are the first 10 days of the month, and the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah are the most blessed days of the year. Laylatul Qadr is the most blessed night, but this is the most blessed days, according to the Sahih Hadith. And the Prophet said, no, these days, good deeds are more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah than any other day. So, of course, it's an encouragement to increase good deeds. Sacrificing for those who aren't at Hajj, to sacrifice, the head of the family sacrifices, a cow, sheep, or something like that. But what is the hukum ruling on sacrificing? Well, the Hanafi school say it's wajib, it's an obligation. If you have the basic means to feed yourself for a week or whatever, then you have money to sacrifice. And it's wajib, an obligation. The other three schools, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, say it's sunnah or sunnah mu'akkada, meaning it's not sinful if you don't do it, but it's a very emphasized sunnah. And the reason why the Hanafi say it's wajib is because there is a hadith, they give a lot of emphasis to this particular hadith, in which the Prophet said, he who has not sacrificed and was able to do so, let him not come to our Eid prayer. Let him not come to this. Wow. So the Hanafis have drawn from that and other texts. This is like saying it's an obligation to sacrifice if you have the means. But it's nice to know that it's not an obligation with the majority of the scholars. It's sunnah mu'akkada. So that now, if someone doesn't do it, we don't say, astaghfirullah, he's doing something haram. He's got no respect for the Sharia, and because he may be following the opinion that it's sunnah, therefore it's not haram if you don't do it. It's better that you do it. And this way, we'll have more tolerance. This way, we'll have more unity and tolerance. Why? Because now my heart is not going to be away from you. But I'm not going to talk to you because this man seems to want to go against Islam and the Sharia. No. If I didn't know there's a difference of opinion, subhanAllah, look what disunity I can cause. And now, one of our biggest problems today is we have young men and women, and they're not always young men and women, they can be old, but let's say young men and women, who think the way that they've been taught is not a way, it's the way. And every other way is not right. Okay? But more often than not, 99% of the times, you might find that their way is a legitimate way. Though not always. The ones that I have in mind, not always. But it's a way, but not the way. Yes, you can say the way in Islam is that we don't drink alcohol. Not a way in Islam, because there's no difference of opinion. The Quran is clear. Scholars are united. Prophet made it absolutely clear. This is the way in Islam, not a way in Islam. But for example, sacrificing for the day of Eid, the opinion that is obligatory, it's an opinion in Islam, not the opinion in Islam. And we must make a difference between an opinion, a legitimate opinion, and the opinion. Because if it's the opinion, then you can't go against it.
If it's an opinion, then you can differ as long as you're following another opinion, which is legitimate. We don't, for example, wearing hijab, the Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, okay, not necessarily a veil, but a headscarf. This is the way of Islam. Okay. Obviously, it doesn't come before praying and fasting and zakat and whatever, but it's an obligation. It's the way of Islam. Okay, not a way. But wearing the face veil, it's an opinion. Why? Because scholars differ. Is it an obligation for a Muslim woman or a recommendation? And they differ from the time of the Sahaba. This is the khimar, the headscarf, okay, that part of hijab is the way. The face veil, niqab, is an opinion. Meaning, it's an obligation. That's an opinion. We need to make the distinctions so that we can have Muslim unity and Muslim flexibility. Okay? So I'll point out those things because we are in need of being tolerant with each other. Either we have two extremes, those who are just overly strict because their way is the way and everyone's way is the highway. Okay? Or everything goes, everything is halal. Don't wear hijab, don't pray 5 times a day. Okay, don't drink, but sit down in a pub and chill out with your workmates, even if you're just having a bit of orange juice. And yeah, this is making everything halal. Okay, even though Islam is a list of haram, 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 that's not Islam. But there are harams and halals in Islam. So we want to know what is clear-cut, what is legitimate difference, so that we can honour both. Alright, okay. So that's Imam Nawawis rahimahullah ta'ala. We are looking at an amazing, pious, righteous, godly scholar. Imam al-Dhahabi says, Al-Imam, Al-Qudwa, Shaykh al-Islam, Al-Zahid, Al-Faqih, Al-Mujtahid. That's how he describes Imam Nawawi in these glowing praises, and that's more or less how every scholar has described him. And he's one of those scholars that there is a united opinion about his imamship. That's not always the case, especially with later scholars. Early scholars it's easy, with a bit later scholars it's not always the case. But there is not a single scholar that doesn't love and hasn't loved Imam An-Nawawi radiyallahu anhu because of what Allah has put in our hearts, because of the barakah and the sincerity and the ilm that this man had. And so he says, rahmatullah alayhi, in the first hadith, An Amir al-Mu'mineen Abi Hafsin Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كانت هجرته للدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه رواه إمام المحدثين أبو عبد الله محمد بن إسماعيل بن إبراهيم بن المغيرة بن بردزبة البخاري وأبو الحسين مسلم بن الحجاج بن مسلم القشيري النيسابوري في صحيحيهما الذين هما أصح الكتب المصنفة. On the authority of the leader of the believers, the commander of the faithful, Abu Hafs Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, who said, I heard the Messenger of Allah, the blessing and peace of Allah be upon him, say, actions are but by intentions, and every man shall have but that which he intended. Thus, he whose migration was for Allah and his Messenger, his migration was for Allah and his Messenger. And he whose migration was to achieve some worldly benefit, or to take some woman in marriage, his migration was for that for which he migrated. This hadith was related by the two imams of the scholars of hadith, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim al-Mughira al-Bardizbah al-Bukhari, Imam al-Bukhari, and Abu Hussein Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj ibn Muslim al-Qushayri al-Naysaburi, Imam Muslim, in their two sahihs, which are the soundest of all the compiled books. That's how Imam Nawawi starts. After his long introduction, which we missed, that's how he starts the first hadith. An Amir al-Mu'mineen Abu Hafs Umar ibn al-Khattab. This hadith is related from the Prophet by whom? Umar ibn al-Khattab. And Umar ibn al-Khattab, what do we know about him? What few things, obvious things, do we know about him? He's Amir al-Mu'mineen. Okay, well, slightly unfair because I mentioned that here. An Amir al-Mu'mineen. Okay, he's Amir al-Mu'mineen, leader of the believers, the caliph of the Muslims. He's Al-Faruq, or his laqab, one of the titles is given is Al-Faruq, and I'll explain why in a minute. What else do we know about him?
So he was second prophet.
He was the second caliph or khalifa of the Muslims. Alhamdulillah. So that's kind of obvious things. Okay, so Amir al-Mu'mineen. Umar radiallahu anhu takes the title Amir al-Mu'mineen. Whereas when he sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam has, for the sake of this discussion, there are two functions he has. He has the function of Nabuwwah, prophethood. And he's a prophet for every person, every Muslim, inside Medina or outside Medina. He is a prophet for every Muslim, whether living in his time or living at the end of days. The second function he had was more limited, in that he was the political leader of the Muslim community in Medina and a few other little places that extended beyond Medina. But he didn't have the political authority of Muslims in other cities during his lifetime, because political authority can only extend as far as maybe your army and your legal judgments extend. Okay? David Cameron's political authority doesn't extend to Pakistan. Although some people might think America and Britain's authority does extend to Pakistan, but that's another thing altogether. Right, okay? Okay, the point being is, when he passed away, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu took up the reins of political authority. He became the successor of the Prophet, not in terms of prophethood, but in terms of political authority, and in this case, religious guidance. So he was called Khalifatul Rasulillah, the successor of the Prophet. Khalifa means successor, one who comes after someone else, one who succeeds someone else. He is the Khalifa to Rasulullah. When Umar then became Caliph 2 years later, he is the successor of the Prophet. He is Khalifatir Rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That became a bit of a mouthful. Khalifatir Rasulillah sallallahu. I'm the successor of the Prophet. And one, he felt it was a bit of a mouthful. Two, he didn't feel himself deserving. Yes, Abu Bakr being the successor of the Prophet makes sense for so many reasons. But for me, Umar ibn al-Khattab, I don't feel I'm worthy of this. But since I am in charge and leading the Muslims, the believers, I will take the title Amir al-Mu'mineen, leader of the believers. That's how that title came into being. It's another word for Caliph, Khalif. Okay? But that's the reason why he had it, because of a humility that he didn't want to be linked with such a noble title. Abu Hafs, the Arabs, not the Sunnah, the Arabs, have this thing that when a man has a child, or even a woman has a child, then you become Abu such and such or such and such. And as a rule of thumb, the man will take on a masculine name. So even though Umar radiallahu anhu's oldest child was Hafsa, who then became one of the wives of the Prophet, but the Arabs have a way of masculinizing it, so it becomes Hafs, Abu Hafs, rather than Abu Hafsa, which will be correct. It's Abu Hafs. It's not that they had to do that, but they did that more often than not. If it was a daughter, can they make that into a male name? Then she has her name, and I have as a Abu something. Okay. Otherwise, having a female Abu Hafsa would have been fine. But he's Abu Hafs because of Hafsa. It also is befitting because it means lion, father of right? Okay. Kind of befits Umar radiallahu anhu. But it's not a sunnah in the sense of, it's a custom of the Arabs. And the only reason why I have an Abu Aaliyah, even though my name isn't Abu Aaliyah Sarkhir, is because over 2 decades ago, some of my teachers from Kuwait in Saudi Arabia, they just called me Abu Aaliyah, which they would naturally do when you have a daughter called Aaliyah. And that name just stuck to the degree that not many people know my name, and everyone calls me Abu Aaliyah, which is good for identity swapping. And he says, Sami'tu Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, and then the hadith, innamal a'malu binniyat. One or two things about Umar radiallahu anhu. What have I got here? He was born in 39 before Hijrah. 39 years before the Prophet made a migration. He was born 39 years before. And he's from a very noble Arab Meccan family. He's the second Khalifa, Amir al-Mu'mineen. He accepts Islam 5 years before the Hijrah. And his acceptance story, his conversion story, is quite famous. He's a very bitter enemy to the to the young Muslim community. There aren't many of them, 10, 15, 20 of them at the most. And he feels that they're kind of ridiculing idols and the way of their forefathers. And he's quite a big, strong, physically impressive person. And one day someone says that he goes and says, "Look, I'm going to sort out this so-called prophet." And as he's walking towards the Prophet or walking towards that direction, someone says, "Oh, sort out your own family first, because your sister and your son-in-law are actually Muslims," which then enrages him even more. He's already got his sword out, so it's like, "Oh, Ibn al-Khattab on the streets, I'll just stay at home," right? That kind of attitude, because no one's going to really mess with him. And he heads towards his sister, and he does her some physical violence because he's that angry. But during that process, he hears the Quran being read. And he's just off. He's struck, not because he's not just an Arab, but he's an eloquent Arab. He's an educated Arab. And he hears this arrogant recital being read, and it just ajaza, it incapacitates him. Like, what is this? Oh, that's Holy Scripture. That's apparently what the Prophet's revelation. That's what he's. Oh, let me read it. And then finally they ask him to wash himself. And he reads it, and he's just and then he sees the truth in it straight away. And he betakes himself off to the Prophet. They're a bit kind of tentative. Is this a trick, or is this a... but it wasn't a trick. He knocks on the door of the Dar al-Nadwa, which the early Muslims, that's their kind of, not secret hiding place, but it's a hiding place. It wasn't a secret because other people knew. It's near one of the mountains, I can't remember, Safar Marwa. It used to be anyway. And they kind of look, it's like, Ibn al-Khattab. They're all saying to the Prophet, "Don't open the door, don't open the door." He wants you to open the door. He says, "Khalas, no, none of us are going to be able to do anything." And the Prophet says, "No, then come in." He comes in. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. And before that, the Prophet had prayed in days gone by, "Oh Allah, give izzah, give might and strength and honor to Islam, either with the conversion of this Umar or that Umar." Meaning Umar ibn al-Khattab or Umar, which was the name of Abu Jahl. And I can't remember his full name, but it's Umar something. And alhamdulillah, within a short time, Umar ibn al-Khattab becomes a Muslim, and that was the time that one felt had a great izzah because they had that protection. Barring the obvious things that we might have heard about him, there are some karamat, some saintly miracles. Okay, karamat, they say kharqul aada, the normal course of things. Allah, from His divine wisdom, He sometimes allows a break in the normal scheme of things, how the universe normally runs. And when that normal way of universe running is broken, something, and we call it, oh, that's like a miracle happening, we call that, if it's done by a prophet, we call it a mu'jiza, splitting of the moon. That's not the normal thing for the moon to just be split in two, but it happened as the Quran relates. That's a mu'jiza, a prophetic miracle. But when it's done by a non-prophet, we call it a karama, from the karama, saintly miracles. From his saintly miracles in Sahih Bukhari is that he's given a khutbah, okay, in Medina, and in the middle of the khutbah he says, "Ya Sariya, al-Jabal, al-Jabal." Oh Sariya, this is the name of the commander that he has sent out with a Muslim army, well outside of Medina, well outside the kind of general Arabian Peninsula. He says, "Oh Sariya, the mountain." Some weeks, or maybe months, I'm not quite sure, later, Sariya and the Muslim army come back from an expedition over yonder, and Sariya says, Omar Radian asked what happened, because it was all going well, then we got ourselves on a predicament, in a situation when we were battling the enemy, because we thought the enemy was in front of us, and we were going to deal with him, but half of the enemy, they went round the mountain and came from behind us. And they would have finished us. But out of the blue, we heard your voice saying, "Oh Sariya, the mountain. And when we looked back to the mountain, we saw the enemy coming from behind us. We got back to our backs in time, and we took them, and we were able to defeat them." Okay.
Subhanallah.
That's an authentic. That's in the Sahih collections. One which has some question about its authenticity, so it's not fabricated, but it has some mild weakness, is when Amr ibn al-As, he conquers Egypt with the Muslim army. And leaving alone the initial story of how he conquers it, and he writes to Umar radiallahu anhu, give us some advice. That in itself is a lesson. But they've conquered it, And the river, the Nile Delta, which is really the lifeblood of Egypt. Most of Egypt's great cities from antiquity have been built on the Nile, and most of Egypt's cities today are still on the Nile Delta, right? Because it's a source of water and so much things, fertility. So what happens is the Nile is overflowing, and it's causing a bit of havoc. So Amr ibn al-As says to the conquered Egyptians, well, how do you deal with this in your history? Because they said, well, what we do is we sacrifice someone to the Nile, and then it stops. So what, your blood sacrifice? Yeah, we get some man, some woman, and that's it, we offer it to the Nile, and most of the time, the Nile, she's happy with us. Well, he goes, but in Islam, we don't do that, we can't do that. So they said to him, so what are you going to do? So he writes Umar down, and he tells them the predicament. That look, that's what they've been doing for however long they've been doing it since, the pharaohs and the kings of Egypt were, there thousands and thousands of years ago.